A drone attack on the Kremlin was thwarted by Russian air defenses Tuesday night. Responsibility for the attack was unknown as of press time Wednesday. Washington and Kiev have denied involvement, while Moscow says it was done by Ukrainians. The Kremlin appeared to be discreet by not charging Washington with a hand at this attempt of regime change, which is the declared policy of a variety of U.S. government agencies, including the State Department. Some say Kiev does not have the technology nor the aerial data to attempt a deep penetration into Russian air defenses like this. Others warn that the U.S. government attempting regime change in Russia risks Moscow invoking Item 2 of its nuclear military doctrine, which allows for the use of nuclear weapons in the case of a tangible threat to the Russian government. An attempted decapitation of the state would likely meet that condition. For more on this, we spoke with Mark Sleboda, analyst and commentator in Moscow, via Skype on Wednesday. Hiya, Mark. Well, I woke up to the news here in New York that this happened, and the first thing I thought of was, the context is that U.S. policy now is regime change in Russia, the State Department anyway, with their decolonize Russia and this other nonsense. And point two of Russia's nuclear doctrine, I don't think anybody's crazy enough to actually push the button, but it's like they're tempting it at this point, and it seems like they're trying to at the same time, because they're blaming it on saying some Russian dissidents did it from Kiev. They're saying this, that what they're trying to do is to spark some kind of uprising or opposition in the streets, kind of opposition to the government in Russia. And all of that is a problem, I think.
Don, okay, so what we know is that early in the morning, before dawn, Russia time, two unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, hit the Kremlin. But I have to say, first of all, the damage was not serious. And that's pretty clear from the videos. One of them essentially hit the flagpole.
Right.
And while it started a fire and some of the roofings in the aftermath, it didn't even bring down the flag or the flagpole.
Right.
Another one hit the Kremlin Senate Palace building, which, despite the name, it's actually the working residence of the president in the Kremlin.
Right.
First of all, the Kremlin, actually, a lot of Americans get this wrong, is not St. Basil's Cathedral. Right. What you think of as the Kremlin is a church. The Kremlin is a walled enclosure, like a old fortress with a number of buildings in it. That's actually next to the St. Basil's on the Red Square. That's actually the Kremlin. So there was actually, we know now, a third drone involved in this attack that went down outside of Moscow. The damage was not serious. The Russian government says the drones were brought down by electronic warfare, but that is not at all clear to me from the pictures I've seen. It looks like they detonated, which is not usually the purpose with electronic warfare, but we'll see. We don't know the exact types, but they were not large combat drones. They did not even appear to be big suicide drones. It's unclear whether they are an indigenous model or some type of commercial jury rigged.
Right.
We have seen there has been a huge drone escalation from Kiev. We also saw drone attacks in Crimea today. In Feodosia that were brought down. We saw drone attacks yesterday in Crimea, which were brought down. We saw drone attacks in Crimea over the weekend, that a drone swarm, that one of them got through and blow up an oil tank. The same thing in Kursk. We're seeing this across the board, right? Big drone attacks in advance of the Kiev regime offensive. There was also a drone attack last week that landed outside of Moscow, stuffed full of C4 explosives that evidently ran out of fuel. So that may have very well been a trial run testing distance or something of the sort. For a certain kind of experimental Ukrainian models of suicide drones that have been developed in the last year, it is about the furthest extent of their range if they're fired from the closest Kiev regime-held territory in Ukraine and Kharkov. But it's also possible that they could have been released from an assassination team within Russia. All right, there are some 5 million Ukrainians in Russia.
Yeah, even within Moscow, really, right?
Yeah, most of them, refugees from the conflict. But it's very easy for the Kiev regime to penetrate it. The Kiev regime has officially denied responsibility. That said, Kiev regime officials already deleted their own Twitter posts celebrating the attack, but the internet never forgets, you idiots. And this is true. The Ukrainian post office has already released a stamp commemorating it that shows the Kremlin in flames, which is a big exaggeration from what actually happened, with the second drone coming in and a Kiev regime militant in the foreground with his finger raised towards the Kremlin, just like they had a stamp created for the bombing of the Crimean Bridge. The Kerch Bridge across the Straits of Crimea, which they also, of course, didn't do. So, so take that for what it's worth. The Western mainstream media, is already on, it's a false flag. Russia plans a major escalation, and they needed this to generate public outrage and sentiment in support of it. Okay, that's just nonsense. I understand that's the way things are done in the U.S., right? You can't have a military conflict without some type of false flag to instigate it. That's your MO. But it's not actually needed here. In fact, actually, I would say that Russian society is demanding more escalation even before this from the Kremlin, and the Kremlin has actually been more restrained, and it's the public that is demanding things be escalated and ended faster.
Well, the current military operation, in fact, that began February last year, that was the result of a demand that was ongoing for 8 years because of Kiev killing all the Russians in the east of the country.
East Ukraine. Yeah, not just Russians, people of East Ukrainians against the Maidan, the overthrow of their government in 2014. It's not just ethnic Russians. There's a lot of ethnic Ukrainians who don't like what was being done in their country. It's more a question of identity and national identity conception than it is pure ethnicity. It's complicated. But yeah, this is a standard MO for Kiev, though, political assassination. You'll remember the terrorist bombings of Daria Dugina and Tatarsky that took out Russian media figures in Russia recently. But the political assassinations of officials, activists, journalists, everyone in former East Ukraine, right? Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk are on almost weekly basis. That happens all the time. It's regular. It's what they've done. There was just today there was also an assassination team planning an attack on the governor of Crimea, Aksionov, and that was stopped. There was also an attack a couple days ago on one of the deputy heads in Melitopol, and also in the former East Ukraine, that was partially successful. He was hospitalized as a result with injuries. But this is routine. This is happening all the time. It just doesn't meet the Western mainstream media headlines. This is a major escalation. Obviously, Russia has reserved the right to respond as they deem anywhere, anytime as they deem necessary. Putin was not actually in the Kremlin at the time. He was in the working residence outside Moscow. So if it was a real targeted assassination attempt, it was bad intelligence. It could have also been a symbolic attack. But regardless, it has to be treated as an attack on the head of state and the state. If a drone hit the White House, countries would be wiped off the face of the earth, right? Let's face it like that. So it also has to be determined, was there Western involvement? Was there Western intelligence, Western explosives, Western drones, targeting, whatnot? Because if it is, that's a whole new ball game, of course. That makes assassination of political leaders on the table and opens it up for a quid pro quo response. Otherwise, I would expect that Russia's response will be limited. But Russian legislature is basically calling for the end of the world right now. There's outrage across Russia. There's a lot of sentiment, and I expect actually the Kremlin to be the restraining voice. Interestingly, Zelensky is not in Ukraine. He is in Finland, conveniently enough, and has already announced he'll be staying there longer than he planned, presumably to avoid any response.
Certainly there will at some point in time be some kind of a response. Yes. Thanks a lot, Mark, for your time, and thanks for talking to us at last minute like this.
No problem.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.